For this side of the worksheet, we are going to solve from 0 to 2 pi, but this time we are not going to include the value of 2 pi, so if we get an answer of 2 pi, we'll have to cross it out. On question 25, we have the word cosine. We need to get it on the same side, and I'm going to bring it over to the side where I have the highest power. So I'm going to have a cosine to the third x minus cosine x equals 0. I now have to factor this. This is going to have a greatest common factor, so I have to take out cosine x. So I'll have cosine x. When I do that, I'll have cosine squared x minus 1 left equals 0. From this point, I could factor the cosine squared x minus 1 into cosine x plus 1 and cosine x minus 1, but instead I'm just going to use the 0 product. So I'm going to take this front one, and that's going to be cosine x equals 0. And then for this second group, it's going to be cosine squared x equals the opposite of our value. So the opposite would be 1. This group is not done. I need to take the square root. So when I take the square root, I'm going to get the cosine x equals plus or minus 1. So now these are the values I need to look up on the unit circle. So first I'm going to look up the cosine, and remember that it is always cosine sine. So cosine is in our first slot. So I'm looking up the cosine of 0, and starting here, that's the cosine is the 1 value, so that won't work. The cosine is going to be 0 at pi over 2. So at x equals pi over 2. And then my cosine is also 0 at 3 pi over 2. Next, I need to look up the cosine being either 1 or negative 1. And in this first spot, my cosine value is 1, but I can only use the 0 and not the 2 pi. I'm actually going to write them both down, though, 0 and 2 pi. And I'm going to cross out the 2 pi. And the reason I'm crossing out the 2 pi is because it does not include the value of 2 pi. Then I need to find another spot where I have a cosine of 1 or negative 1. And it happens over here at the value of pi. So I can also add in that x would equal pi. For question number 23, I'm going to have to get the word tangent all on the same side and then factor it. So I'm going to start out with 3 tangent to the third x minus tangent x equals 0. I'm going to take out my greatest common factor again. So factoring out a tangent x, I'll be left with 3 tangent squared x minus 1 equals 0. So I was taking the greatest common factor of tangent x and being left with 3 tangent squared x and then minus 1. This I'm not going to factor. I can't do it with the 3 in the front, so I'm going to use my 0 products. So one is going to be the tangent of x equals 0, and the other is going to be 3 tangent squared x equals 1. I need to divide by the 3, so tangent squared x is going to equal 1/3. And then I need to still keep going and take the square root. So tangent of x is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 1, which would be 1, and over the square root of 3. From this point, I need to look these values up on the unit circle. It's a little different in this case because I always have a cosine and a sine. And I have to remember that my tangent is sine over cosine. So if it's sine over cosine, to get a 0, I have to have the sine value on top is going to have to be a 0. So what would give me a sine of 0? And then I'm going to have cosine on the bottom, and I really don't even care what the value would be on the bottom, so I'm pretty much just looking up when is my sine value going to be 0. So my sine is 0 at 0 and 2 pi. So I have x equals 0 and x equals 2 pi, but I cannot be that value. And I'm going to continue on and see where else I could have a sign being a 0. And the other location is over at pi. Next, I need to look up the tangent being a plus or minus 1 over the square root of 3. And the tangent, remember, again, is sine over cosine. So I really only want to look at the tops. This top value here is going to be the sine value, and this is going to be the cosine. And it works out kind of nice because it's right over here on pi over 6. This would be my sine, and that would be my cosine. And if I would have 1 over 2 over square root of 3 over 2, the 2's would cancel out, and that would leave me with 1 over the square root of 3, which is what I want. So the first time this happens, and really what I'm doing is just looking at the top values, because I know the 2's are going to cancel out. Sine over cosine would be 1 over the square root of 3 will happen at pi over 6. So one of them is going to be pi over 6. And then, since it's a plus minus, it's probably going to be all 4 of them at the ones with the 6 in the bottom. So if I come over here, I'd have 1 over negative square root of 3, which would be at 5 pi over 6. Then I'm going to have negative over negative, 1 over the square root of 3 then, positive at 7 pi over 6, and then again into 11 pi over 6. So I will have, adding in here, 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, and lastly 11 pi over 6.